Hi, I'm Anna and welcome back to my channel, Building a Business. So a critical question that all rental real estate investors have to determine for themselves is how much cash should you have on hand for when expenses and vacancies and other monetary issues come up. In this video, I'm going to be discussing why having cash reserves is so important and the somewhat complicated way that I am going to be going about determining how much cash reserves I believe I should have for my portfolio. So one of the major ways that rental real estate investing differs from investing in stocks and bonds is that you need to have a significant amount of cash on hand for any expenses. These expenses could be caused by vacancies, maintenance, repairs, capital expenditures, your monthly mortgage payment, interest, and taxes, as well as many others. And in the worst case scenario, if you have an expense that comes up and you don't have the cash reserve set aside to deal with that expense, then you could end up losing your property. Of course, when we're talking about cash reserves, the natural next question is, okay, I know I need cash reserves, but how much do I need? And what I've found is that if you ask 50 different investors, they'll give you 50 different answers, which can be very confusing and somewhat frustrating. One of the most common answers that I have heard is investors giving you a monetary range, and I generally hear that range somewhere between $3,000 to $5,000 per single family home. Another common way that people tend to determine how much cash they should have on hand is based off of the rent that they charge. So for instance, they may decide that they want somewhere between 3 to 6 months of rent set aside in cash for anything that comes up. And if you compare the two different options, the $3,000 to $5,000 versus the 3 months to 6 months of rent, those values tend to be fairly similar. And if in your specific situation they're not at all similar, then I would probably go with the larger number. And these two different options for determining how much you should have in cash are very simple and easy to determine. I find that they actually miss two key factors that I think you should take into account when determining how much cash to have on hand. The first of these factors is the number of properties that you own, and that's because in general, the more properties you own, the less risk you have. Let's say, for example, that you have one property and it typically cash flows at $200 per month. If all of a sudden you have a vacancy for 4 months, you have lost 100% of your cash flow, and you still have to make your mortgage payment and pay for taxes, insurance, and more. Therefore, this event has a huge impact on your bottom line. Instead, let's say you have 10 properties, all of which cash flow $200 per month for a total of $2,000 per month when you combined all 10 properties. Again, one property has a vacancy for 4 months. Your cash flow from that one property drops from $200 to $0, but the cash flow for your whole portfolio has only dropped from $2,000 to $1,800. Yes, it's still a drop, but it's far less impactful to your overall bottom line. And yes, you still have expenses that you have to take care of on that property that's vacant, but your income from the other 9 properties should more than cover those expenses. Hopefully that brief example helped illustrate why having more properties is less risky, at least in terms of how much cash you should have per property. The second factor that I think is really important in determining how much cash you should have on hand is whether or not your properties have mortgages on them, and if so, how much your monthly payment is. Let's say you have one property owned outright, as in you don't have a mortgage. You decide to set aside $3,000 as cash reserves and that your average monthly taxes, insurance, and other expenses for the property that occur whether or not you have a tenant are about $500 per month. If you experience a vacancy for 4 months, you would have to pay approximately $2,000, which is less than the $3,000 you have reserved, so you should be okay financially. However, if that same property had a mortgage, then you may be in trouble. The $500 that you had to spend per month in the previous example still applies, but you additionally have to pay your monthly mortgage payment, which let's assume is $500 per month. After the 4-month vacancy, you had to spend $4,000 on expenses and mortgage payments, but you only had $3,000 in cash reserves. Clearly, this example shows that having a monthly mortgage payment on a property increases the expenses of that property, and therefore I think it should be taken into account when determining how much cash you have on hand. So now that I've explained why the number of properties that you have and whether or not you have mortgages on those properties should impact the amount of cash reserves you have on hand, I'm going to jump into the numbers where I show you how I personally will be calculating how much cash reserves I plan to have at any given moment in my investing career.
So here's what I've determined makes the most sense for me. If I have one property, I'm going to keep 12 months of rent in cash. If I have 2 properties, I'm going to save 2 months of rent per property. If I have 3 properties, then I'm going to save 5 months of rent per property. With 4 properties, I'll save 4 months of rent per property. With 5 properties, I will save 3.5 months of rent per property. And with 6 properties and beyond, I will save 3 months of rent per property. And the way I came up with these values was essentially I looked at the graph. This blue curve shows the graph of these values. These values is the percentage of my portfolio that one property is, given the number of properties that I have in my portfolio. So when I have one property in my portfolio, then one property is equivalent to 100% of my portfolio. But if I have 2 properties in my portfolio, then one property is equivalent to only 50% of my portfolio. If I have 3 properties, one property is a third or 33% of my portfolio, and continually it decreases and decreases. And when we get down to 10 properties, then each property is worth 10% of my portfolio. Now, of course, this is assuming that all of the properties are worth the same amount, which won't likely be exactly the case. However, I plan on purchasing properties that are fairly similar in value to each other. So what I decided is that in the long run, having 3 months of rent makes sense for me. That's what I feel comfortable with. And I decided that I feel comfortable having 3 months of rent once each individual property is equivalent to less than 20% of my overall portfolio. So essentially that means that once I have 6 properties, I feel okay with having 3 months of rent saved up per property. So what I did is I graphed these values, as you see the blue curve here, and then I knew this value here with 6 properties, I wanted to be equivalent to about 3 months of rent. And continuing on, I wanted all of these values to be 3 months of rent. But before that, I wanted the curve to more or less match the blue curve in terms of the greater percentage of my overall portfolio that any given property was, the more months of rent I wanted to have saved as a buffer. Then similarly, in terms of having monthly mortgage payments, if I only have one property, I would like to have 12 months of monthly mortgage payments saved up. That's in addition to the 12 months of rent that I would have saved up. Then with 2 properties, I would have 7 months of mortgage payments saved up per property. And again, that's in addition to the 7 months of rent saved up per property. And then similar values as you see continuing down with 5 months of mortgage payments per property, 4 months of mortgage payments per property, 3.5 months of mortgage payments per property, and then 3 for the rest of the properties. So if that seemed a little confusing, we can now look at a specific example which will hopefully clear things up a bit. So in this particular example, I'm assuming that I'm going to get 10 mortgages. The mortgage payment for each property is going to be $360 per month, and then the rent per property will be $1,000 per month. So now I can see when I have one property, I need 12 months of rent and mortgage payments saved up. So in terms of the rent savings, that's equivalent to $12,000 or 12 times $1,000 per month. And because I have only one property, the total rent savings is $12,000. In terms of the mortgage payments, it's equivalent to $360 per month times 12 months, and that's equivalent to $4,320. Again, we only have one property, and so the total mortgage savings is $4,320. When I add the mortgage savings and the rent savings, I come up with the total cash reserves that I would feel comfortable with of $16,320. If we move on to 2 properties, then you can see I would like 7 months of rent and mortgage savings saved up. So the rent savings per property is 7 months times $1,000 per month, which is equivalent to $7,000 per property. Given that there are 2 properties, we multiply that by 2 and get $14,000. Similarly with the mortgage, we determine that by multiplying 7 months times $360 per month for a value of $2,520 per month per property. Again, because we have 2 properties, we multiply that by 2 to get a total mortgage savings of $5,040. Our total cash reserves then comes out to $19,040, and if you divide that by 2 to determine what the cash reserves per property is, you get $9,520 per property. Now we just continue this down the line, and as you can see, the rent savings per property decreases until we hit our consistent 3 months per property. And similarly, our mortgage savings per property decrease until we hit 3 months. Once we are able to obtain 10 mortgages on 10 properties with these given rent and mortgage values, then we will have a total cash reserves of $40,800. Now let's look at a similar example, but in this case we have no mortgage payments. The rent savings per property and the total rent savings will be exactly the same because the rent per month is exactly the same for all the properties, but because we have no mortgage, these values are all zero, meaning that the total cash reserves we have once we have 10 properties is significantly less. It's $30,000 compared to, if you remember in the previous example, was about $40,000. Now let's look at an example that's significantly more complicated, but also more realistic. So in this case, the rent that each property gets per month varies depending on the property. So for property 1, the rent is $1,000 per month. For property 2, the rent is $2,000 per month, and so on. Similarly, the mortgage payment per month also differs based off of the property. So here we have the sum of the monthly rent for all of the properties owned. In this case, we only have one property owned and the monthly rent is $1,000, so the sum is just the same, $1,000. The total rent then that we need in order to get 12 months of rent is $12,000. Similarly, with the sum of the monthly mortgage, it's just that one value of $350 per month, and we multiply that by 12 to get $4,200. The total cash reserves then for 1 month is $16,200. Then when we have 2 properties, the sum of the monthly rent jumps up to $3,000 because we're adding $2,000 plus $1,000. Now because we want to have the sum of the monthly rent for 7 months, we multiply 3,000 by 7 and we get $21,000. The same applies for the sum of the monthly mortgage payments, which in this case is $700 plus $350. And we continue down in the same way. So once we get down to property number 10, this $14,250 is equivalent to the sum of all of these 10 individual rent values for each property. And then we multiply that value by 3 months of rent and get $42,750. Same for the monthly mortgage payments. This $5,100 value is equivalent to all of these monthly mortgage payments combined. And then multiply by 3 to get the total monthly mortgage payments. And when we add the total rent savings and the total mortgage savings, we have a total cash reserves of $58,050. So of course these values are just totally made up. However, they're just meant to illustrate the concept of how my system would work in the real world, where the rents and the mortgage payments will not be exactly the same for every single property.
Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please like it below and subscribe to follow along on my journey.